Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa, since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. In this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast, we engage with the collaborators behind the inaugural Now architecture competition. It's a unique and new take on the opportunities afforded by a new sporting event in the Cape Town calendar, the Formula E racing, and a brief to design a sustainable and functional pavilion within the context of the mother city. How could such a piece of infrastructure, the pavilion, work to foster integration and connection between different parties whilst responding to the obvious functional requirements of spectator seating and other uses? Some episodes ago, we spoke to Dr. Dean Allen about the legacy of the FIFA World Cup, and whilst opinions still remain split on what that legacy was and how it continues to shape up in the stadia and the public transportation infrastructure from that era, this conversation tackles something that is emerging and exciting for the future. What could the legacy be, and what are the factors the competition organisers are wanting entrants to respond to? You'll hear from four of the collaborators behind the competition, why they've chosen this event and what they hope to achieve, and who they hope to inspire and encourage to enter the competition. Although all have African heritage, the episode finds the guests spread across the European and African continents. It's encouraging to learn of these young professionals' passion for the issues of transformative infrastructure and for South Africa in general. As always, we hope you enjoy the episode. So it's just gone 5 o'clock on the 1st of August, Tuesday afternoon. I'm delighted to be joined today by four young professionals around the globe, across in Europe and here in South Africa, joined by a group of colleagues who are trying to work towards a design competition, specifically around this idea of Formula E. It came to Cape Town, I think it was February this year, and this consortium has put together a proposal whereby they're inviting contestants to take part in an urban design competition. I know very little about Formula E. I know very little about the background to the project. But when I spoke to Sebastian Hitchcock about it last week, he really gave me a sense of something quite exciting, a different approach, how we can use design competitions to invigorate and stimulate, particularly our younger professionals. So, Sebastian, to you and the team, welcome. Let's start with you. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll go around the doors as to who else is in the room.
Thanks, Peter. It's a joy to be here. I'm Sebastian, one of the team members of the Now competition. We are really just a group of recent graduates and young professionals who were slightly jealous of other architecture competition ecosystems around the world and believed that it's time that South Africa and the rest of Southern African countries or African countries could begin to birth, hopefully, a new architecture platform for new design competitions, just to basically provide a new space for young professionals as students to pitch projects and win big prizes. And I'm joined by three of the jury for our first competition who will, hopefully introduce themselves shortly.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, Sebastian. Great to have you on board. Let's go across the water to London. Sarah, welcome. How are you keeping?
Hi, Pete. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast today. And I'm very excited to be part of the jury for the Now competition. I'm an architectural designer and researcher from Johannesburg, currently based in London. My work is grounded in critical theoretical explorations and experimental design research. So some of my research interests include racial and spatial justice, the politics of the body and space, and then challenging and reimagining the traditional architectural canon and the practice of architecture in general. I've worked for some quite interesting creative practices in South Africa as well as globally. This includes Local Studio, Counterspace, the Graduate School of Architecture, the African Futures Institute based in Ghana, and I'm currently a researcher at Ajay Associates in London.
Fantastic, Sarah. Well, you're very, very welcome here. Thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. Looking forward to hearing how that theoretical sort of link comes into the competition and how you're going to utilize those skills in the evaluation of entries. So looking forward to that. Across, or rather south of you, from London into the fantastic country of France. Don't think we've had anybody from. No, I speak under correction. We have spoken to people in France before, but Mr. Lloyd Martin, how are you, sir? Whereabouts in the beautiful France do we find you today, sir?
Hi there, Pete. Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm in Bordeaux at the moment. I'm not originally from France. I was actually born in Zimbabwe. I grew up in Botswana. I mean, I trained architecture in South Africa. So it's just my wife who is French, hence me being here for the time being. My architecture is centered around Africa, and I've spent, the last 5 years working and doing research on a kind of architects in Nigeria, where I helped to set up an architecture school there. I've done extensive work on the architect Demas Nwoku, for example, who's just received the Venice Biennale Golden Lion Award, which I think Sarah had some kind of part in as well. I'm the founder of Locus Metis. It's a architecture sort of idea that I've just kind of put forward. And I'm particularly focused on really and truly sustainable architecture when it comes to a kind of African context. And I'm experimenting with new forms of habitation and new forms of urban sort of situations. And I'm very interested in seeing how people start to challenge the notion of what sustainability is, especially when it comes to this project. But I think we can diverge into that a bit further. But yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad to be a part of this team.
Well, thanks for, again, making the time, Lloyd. Appreciate it. And again, each of you, it sounds like there's a podcast, an episode for each of you as to what you're doing and how you've got to where you're at today. But thanks again for sharing time. Last but certainly not least, in Cape Town, just down the way, we've just spent a bit of the afternoon together. But Roland, good to hear your voice. How you been keeping, and what's news at your end with the young urbanists?
Thanks, Pete. It's always lovely to talk on the tip of Africa. I think today our event that we attended at the Civic Centre that was hosted by Spatial Planning really speaks volumes about the competition we are doing today, which is around how do we envision and give young people a tool around envisioning for a better, more bolder Africa. Young Urbanists is an NPC based in South Africa. We think global but local. I know that's a bit of a cheesy saying, but ultimately to support young people, ultimately around how to actually realize our cities, but also about awareness, community, and engagement. Because ultimately we feel everyone's an urbanist. A country like South Africa, and I think probably symbolic of the rest of Africa, is that we are urban and we are young. So how do we actually change that paradigm and this opportunity we have intergenerationally? And I think that's the opportunity. It starts with competition, a bit of dreaming, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of the Now competition and the Talking Transformation podcast.
No, thanks to you, Roland. Great to have all four of you here. Looking forward to getting into it. And let's kick it off. Sebastian, what's this all about? Tell us about why you've chosen the Formula E as one of new upcoming events in the sporting calendar. It's been a big hit here, I think, in Cape Town. But again, I say I have no background to it. If you believe the hype, it's brought a lot of money into the city. What it probably has done is start to rethink some of the roads and the approaches and the landscape that goes with that. You can imagine how beautiful it looks seeing the backdrop of Cape Town on TVs. But that's not what this is about. This surely goes to some of what Sarah's talking about legacy projects and how you can start to make things interact with the local community, the heritage, and the space. Tell us a bit about what you're hoping to gain through this project.
Yeah, one of the key things Roland mentioned there was young voices and young people. Yeah, in the discussion of what should be the first architectural brief, or the team in the Now, we discussed long and hard what should be the brief, and we decided to go with something topical, something that allows for, let's just say, bold design strategies, being the amount of money that's coming into this event and the fact that it is temporary, something that young designers can explore quite easily and quickly as a first proposition, and with the hope of definitely having future briefs being more topical and surrounding different places, not just the tip of Africa. I think boldness and just allowing people the space to really explore different briefs was our key objective with this first competition. Another side of that is prize money. We believe that valuing an architect's work with prizes of hopefully a substantial amount in the future is something that can begin to just let these designers dream a bit more and show them that they're worth it when they submit an excellent proposal.
And Sebastian, just to be very specific, what exactly is the infrastructure that the competition is seeking to design for?
So for this competition, the Formula E, we are asking to design a future pavilion for Formula E, something that can be temporary or of a permanent nature, taking into account that the event could be running for the next 10 years in and around Greenpoint. Obviously, Formula E has a mission statement of sustainability at the forefront, but one can also then take into consideration the socio-political and socio-historical reasoning around the word sustainability and what's truly sustainable. Leaving that up to the designers, there's a certain scale that needs to be taken into account for this pavilion, yet the use of the pavilion does not necessarily just have to be a grandstand, but can go beyond that and take into all the additional uses of such a structure.
What is the engagement you've had with Formula E? You've got a scope, you've got a design, you've got the competition rules, etc. How have you engaged with them and what's their response been so far?
All proposals are speculative. Nothing is going to be built. We have communicated with Formula E that we want to present them these ideas and they're extremely excited about that. Obviously, having something like this come to life, it's a multi-year process. One first has to make proposals and see how feasible things are. But we do believe that with big brands, big sponsors, and a lot of eyes on an exhibition or proposals could hopefully bring traction to young designers' ideas and hopefully bring some of these ideas to life or link them with possible opportunities in the future.
Thanks. I think that helps at least orientate around what it's about and how you've gone about engaging with the respective partners. If we come, Sarah, to some of the background and the context, you talked about your work and your desires to challenge some of the traditional norms and theory. How do you see this project as being able to expand on some of those ambitions of yours?
I'm definitely going to be looking at how the entrants bring in outside perspectives, such as urban theorists and architectural writers and so on. I think the context of Cape Town is also very important to consider from a current social perspective as well as a historical and political perspective. It's really interesting to think about the history of race cars in the city in particular throughout apartheid and how it's sort of reframed and can be a force for good today.
Lloyd, you also talked about the importance of things like social responsibility, sustainability of these initiatives. How have you started to think about these things within the context of the way that you've set out the design parameters or the competition parameters?
The notion of this project and this event is that it's coming in as this big sustainable alternative to the Formula One. What I want to see from this competition and from the design proposals is something that challenges that. I would love to see how the proposals actually come up with a completely new concept and a new understanding of sustainability that goes beyond these simple ideas of catchphrases and keywords and truly engages with the society that it's being designed for, which is something that's very challenging to do so. Also, the idea that this race is a very foreign concept to South Africa. I know that the idea of racing and things it's a very westernized idea, but that doesn't necessarily sit with all the different cultures and all the different social aspects of Cape Town's society. So I would love to see how the structure can engage with and bring in a new aspect of like a potentially unseen story or unseen critical approach.
If I think about stands and pavilions, I've been fortunate enough to finish things like the Cape Town cycle race, previously known as the Argus. And you saw when you come to the finish, there's temporary stands. When you think of those Formula One, you think of those massive stands that go way back, literally hosting hundreds of thousands of people. I guess there's only so many different ways of doing it in terms of permanent versus temporary. So again, how does the conventions and the parameters that you've set in your outline of the contest start to challenge what's being done versus what's possible, particularly within what's quite a sensitive space there in the Greenpoint area? I know, particularly in terms of community participation and so forth, it's an area where you need to be very sensitive to how you go about it, because there will be a lot of public interest and potential conflict around how people see that space, how it's being used, etc. And I would say that given the history of the stadium, particularly around 2010 and so forth. But Seb, let's come to you first, sir.
Thanks, Pete. I think this question also helps clarify to possible participants just around the definition of a grandstand compared to a pavilion. A pavilion is if one thinks it from like an architectural education perspective of the Serpentine Pavilion, it's not only just a space of seating or shelter, but it really is a space or a typology that allows for discourse beyond just a use, and could be really anything. Could be a structure to make an intersection or a point, or illustrate a greater narrative beyond just a grandstand. So we're really asking for a building along the racetrack which could contribute to the brief in a way that goes beyond just utility and brings a new perspective to this brand new event as it gets going.
Roland, your thoughts from a Cape Townian-centric view, given you're living here over this last few years?
Well, we know that Cape Town as a city might have its clean audits. It's still a city that hasn't really moved on from the scars of apartheid era spatial planning. And in fact, we've actually been maintaining apartheid era spatial planning through prioritizing cars, prioritizing developments that are not safe for pedestrians, more malls and more estates that doesn't speak to anything about identity and about inclusivity and access. I think from our side as a little NPC that's trying to be a voice of young people is that a competition like Now, Pete just mentioned the Cape Town cycling tour. The ironies of the tour was that it was actually meant to advocate for infrastructure and access to non-white South Africans when it comes to active mobility, and particularly cycling as a form of commuting, and making sure the spaces and access to bicycles is equitable and also safe, particularly for infrastructure, where we still have a city that's built around cars and not cyclists. We also always have the view that if it's safe to cycle, it's safe to walk. We do know the majority of our people use public transportation and walk. So I think, back to a competition like this, it allows us to dream and have these kind of conversations around space and access, particularly around catalytic events like the Formula E. We know the benefits of the World Cup had on infrastructure, not just in Cape Town, across the country, BRT, public upgrades, the fan walk, and so forth. So I think for this is just another opportunity, but to cement into young voices. But then the next challenge is, how do we actually get the city to build these spaces, to make them more accessible? And I think the brief speaks about that. How do we actually make more accessible spaces through the Formula E? And I think that's the opportunity. How do we translate theory into practice? And how do we use this opportunity as a city when we have all these constraints to make Cape Town a bit more caring, more livable, and accessible to all?
How does the pavilion, as I say, a piece of infrastructure, which either looks nice or looks ugly depending on how you do it, how does that start to support these very important concepts of transformation, redress, and so forth, that you're clearly trying to link the project to redress, and particularly the legacy of apartheid, which still pervades through not just Cape Town, but most of our cities, most of our towns, in fact, the landscape of South Africa. So how do you think we can start to use this as, I say, a single piece of infrastructure, which may or may not look nice, but that starts to impact on these deep-rooted issues, whether you be from the Khayelitsha community, whether you be down in Makassar or towards the north in the Dunoon? People listening to this might be saying, Formula E, pavilion, what language are we talking about here in relation to the day-to-day challenges that I may be facing? So I'm trying to look at it not through a skeptic's point of view, but from a realistic point of view of linking these things very clearly and being quite precise in the language and the way we communicate this, not just to our audience listening to this, but to a broader community who we're trying to get involved and understand the scope and the power of this particular initiative. Lloyd, some thoughts?
The way that you've posed that question is exactly the kind of answer that should be sought. And the actual pavilion itself, the proposal, and one that we want to see, it has to just answer, obviously just the basics of what the brief is calling for. And what should then happen is an intensive research process that doesn't answer everything. I mean, I think it's a mythos that architecture can solve all of these different questions, and the scope and breadth of, the societal, economical, sustainability issues that we think that we can solve. So I think that, a strong proposal will be one that does the absolute bare minimum of solving all of the different issues that the brief has set out, but then goes one step beyond that looks for a key aspect or a narrative or a string of research that can be elevated and played upon and really expressed through an architectural form. And I think that what I would sort of be more attracted to is a proposal that flips the notion of the sustainability being electronic, being battery powered being this sort of futuristic techtopian vision. Instead, going for a more grounded, sustainable, holistic proposal that can go beyond just a simple stand that gets taken down at the end of the day. I'd want to see something that can be utilized afterwards and can start to challenge this sort of energy climate that Cape Town is currently in, the whole of South Africa is currently in. Challenge the notion that we don't need electric cars, we need passive, sustainable systems instead. So I would love to see it going in that direction. But obviously that is more sustainable driven. And then there's a whole different narrative and the interesting kind of political and social aspects as well that has a lot of rich history and things to delve into.
Yeah, I think I'm quite interested in almost zooming out to understand what hosting this type of event in Cape Town would mean. So a large-scale public event that it intends to kind of draw in foreign investment and promote South Africa, I suppose, on a global stage. But I think it can also lead to a lot of challenges, especially in our context of neoliberalism. Firstly, I think large-scale events like these have a strong focus on privatization and profit-making, which tend to prioritize corporate interests over the needs of local communities. Second, I think the influx of investment often benefits a select few, and the local populations don't necessarily reap those economic rewards. Thirdly, I think these types of events risk commodifying local culture and public spaces. One other point that I had was around neglecting long-term needs and sustainability. And I tend to agree with Lloyd in that the design proposals are obviously not able to tackle all these questions and provide solutions. But I think through the process of designing, through the process of being speculative, it may not answer questions, but pose more questions. And I think at the end of the day, that process is almost as important as the final proposal.
I think what's really brave and something to be championed here is the fact you've taken, let's call it a new wave initiative. And I think back, you've mentioned, Sebastian, I think the 2010 initiative. And that was clearly a massive catalyst around infrastructure, massive infrastructure, whether it's Gautrain up in Jozi and Tshwane, Kuruleni, the airports that were built, the BRTs that certainly are established in places like Cape Town and Jozi. There are still questions around legacy. What you've done here, I think, is to start to look at newly established initiative, the Formula E, and are saying, what could it be? And how do we take one piece and start to think it through on a more 360 approach, as opposed to purely the profit? You're not going to bring something like Formula E if it's unprofitable to Cape Town or any other city around. So there has to be that financial hook to hang it on. What you're asking is, what more can it be than just that single hook of it looks cool, it looks fast, it looks sustainable in quotes. And I think you've been quite articulate there, Lloyd, in saying that it needs to be more than that. Your thoughts from this side, Roland, in terms of what you've heard, the sort of the broader narrative, I think, of electric vehicles. I mean, the mobility space has been something that you've been very active in personally, as well as one of the young urbanists' primary focus areas.
I mean, it's very pertinent, it's very topical. We know that in a country like ours, where the biggest public transportation is taxis, which is actually a private service, right? It's barely subsidized nor supported. There's a big chunk of us that do own cars or can afford cars, and then some of us maybe take BRT, or even if we're even brave enough to cycle, but the majority of us, more of us, do walk. But what we know that is petrol prices going to go up, and what that means is it's not going to disappear, it's just going to get more expensive. We really have a lot of constraints in our economy, stagnating, high unemployment rate, youth unemployment more than 60%. And transportation is one of those things where the majority of us still spend 4 to 5 hours, most of our income, and that's only going to increase with fuel prices. And what we also know from national is that there's this whole kind of narrative of electrical vehicles. Now, EV stands for not just private cars, but also other things like micro-mobility, so e-bicycles and e-scooters and other forms of, or even electrifying buses. But the narrative still has been around electrical vehicles, private vehicles, and we know that no one in our economical bracket can afford them, let alone actually address congestion. But I think back to your point, Pete, and everyone's points is that competitions has a special part to play in South Africa and post-apartheid, and how that's a catalytic for good. And that's the opportunity where I think young people saying, let's do more of this, but also kind of two birds, one stone of having a space to get young people, African built form professionals, to dream of an alternative country or continent. And again, like I emphasize, it's part of the design brief is to think bigger around the negative effects of having a heavy reliance on private transportation, but also for us to say that we need to speak up against these false paradigms, that if we do want to have justice and equity and follow evidence-based, we need to focus active mobility and public transportation. Yes, we need to electrify our buses and our taxis, and these things are happening. But also then about the public spaces, last mile, what are the public spaces? This is something that the World Cup got right, but we do still need to push the envelope. It's amazing opportunity, and I think something we need to get behind, but the narrative matters. And something that I think that hit me that the Deputy Mayor said today, a part of our event at Spatial Planning, is that we need young people to mobilize and increase our civic participation. South Africa has a very low civic participation, below 30%. With our elections coming up next year, again, this is topical. So perhaps, yes, we need to support other built from professional students and architects, but also how do we communicate to the broader public around the benefit? And I think a competition like this, that's a bit more visually, allows us to dream, but we do need to focus on then how do we mobilize and integrate with all the things that are happening around democracy and civic participation, whether it's local or national.
Maybe, Sebastian, you can take us through some of the pointers that you refer to in your brief. We'll get to how people can get hold of that just now. But you talk about some of the elements like urban acupuncture, the prioritization of engagement, the socio-historical context. Some of these things we've touched on. Maybe you just want to touch again on what you've called the things to remember in the brief and why you've selected those handful of points as almost a starting point, your underpinning principles that contestants would need to think about. And then we'll come to Sarah and Lloyd around actually how are you going to actually use that to evaluate and prioritize those responses you get.
Just to also touch on something you mentioned earlier. Yeah, the Nana really, when we speak about topical briefs, this really comes from a place of wanting to dream of the future and not trying to fix problems. We have so many chances in our architectural education to get briefs where we are tasked with fixing problems. And really this competition doesn't want to say that's wrong at all in any way, but we are trying to provide topical briefs where we can dream. So that's also part of the reason why we chose this event. And in the things to remember, I wouldn't call it a criteria, but rather we try to mention a variety of different things, not that people have to follow, but just to kind of let their brain wander. They should remember that it's an event. It's a temporary thing where many people do come together at one moment, which provides a lot of energy and opportunity to do something special. The idea of urban acupuncture is just to relate to the fact that this pavilion does not have to stand on its own, but can take into account some sort of systems approach along the racetrack if it wants to. We also spoke about the idea that the Formula E doesn't only have a racetrack, but also prioritizes stuff such as fan engagement with the people racing, but fan engagements or signing of autographs or ways of people viewing the event could really be rethought. And lastly, a thing that Roland really dove into was the fact that the invention of cars, roadways, and traffic infrastructure has obviously provided extreme convenience, but what has that taken away from us in terms of a negative urban consequence? And how can we rethink that regarding the large idea of urban mobility, and how does this racetrack fit into that? Another interesting thing is Formula E is the one sport which prioritizes a street circuit, whilst Formula One often uses a circuit that's away from the city. And what sort of discourse does that open up in terms of the use of large-scale urban infrastructure?
If we then move into that sort of evaluation space, Lloyd and Sarah, I'm looking at the things like the positioning, the size and cost, functionality, accessibility. There are certain things that you're looking for.
I think I'll start with talking about this idea of architecture as a solution that solves problems. I definitely tend to agree with Sebastian on that point, but I also think it's important to think about this competition in relation to history. I think for me, the proposals that respond to those kind of more critical questions, as opposed to the very practical, infrastructural and technical aspects of it, will be interesting in the context of an architectural competition, which kind of provides students and young practitioners a space to be experimental, to not have the constraints or the fear of failing as you do in architecture schools. I think that offers a really exciting point of departure. So I think in terms of like the historical and social context of Cape Town, I think students should be asking themselves questions about who the design is for. Is it only for Formula One fans? Is it catering to Greenpoint? How does it bring in other groups from Cape Town? And then obviously around, is it inclusive and accessible? I would like to sort of reframe what this means, to focus less on aesthetic and more on an architectural projects program, because I think when we talk about aesthetics, we risk essentializing African cultures into one and possibly reducing it into a stereotype or style. The entrants should look at how to sort of engage with local communities, involve them in design processes, respecting traditional knowledge systems, and then also look at the programmatic responsiveness of architecture to cater to the daily needs and activities of whom the design is for. How can architectural spaces facilitate rituals, accommodate difference, and bring people together? If I was approaching the brief, I would want to ask myself a lot of those questions before getting into the actual design and thinking about how to tackle and work through those very important issues.
The brief is calling for something quite grounded. And even though I'm like a big proponent of something that's going to be super sustainable, grounded, that's going to be reused afterwards, I think, Sarah and Sebastian were both completely right in the fact that this is an architectural student competition, and it's an opportunity to really test ideas and to project yourself beyond just the constraints of the day-to-day reality, and to maybe even touch upon the fact that it's not trying to solve South Africa's problems. It's instead an opportunity to elevate certain aspects or elevate certain cultural identities. Because at the end of the day, like the Formula E is bringing in a lot of money because there's a lot of international eyes. So it is an opportunity to showcase something, but be very careful to not over commodify it. Because I mean, Sarah was saying, the commodification of culture. And I think a lot of international competitions get that very wrong about Africa. As soon as they have this competition, everyone comes in with this idea of trying to solve the problems, and all the imagery is exactly the same. And all the houses, for example, are just a copy and paste of like a Francis Carré building, without understanding the cultural relevance of how someone like that actually arrived at those answers and those solutions. So there's people like Ola Lekan Jayefus, who also received some accolades at the Venice Biennale, where they look at the future projections of how an African city can manifest. And perhaps this is an amazing opportunity to see what would have happened if this type of mobility movement, if urban patterns were determined and designed for by the people of Cape Town and by the people of Africa in this context. I put it to anyone that's challenging this proposal to really just free yourself from the constraints whilst absolutely understanding and processing and showing us that you understand and have processed all of the kind of historical, sustainable elements that we've talked about to produce something that's inspiring instead of just solving issues.
It's an opportunity to dream and dream with bold. Yes, it might not respond to all the crises we are facing in South Africa in 2023, but it's a way to dream, but also to say, how does South Africa interlink with the rest of Africa? And what is the South Africa dream as well? I think that's very important. So the appeal here is that this is something that I know as an organization, when we're an advocacy organization, we want ideas that we can back and lobby, ultimately that inspires change and positivity, particularly around space. Space, I think, is such an opportunity to really realize our democracy. The thing with South Africa post-apartheid is most of our ideas are in books and policies and documents. It has not been realized by the executive. So that's the opportunity. We have lots of progressive people in government, in the private sector, and we need to bring those things together. And a platform like this allows people, young people in particularly, to dream around space and what kind of country and continent we want to become. And I think that's my appeal, is to not stop dreaming, but also understand how can I actually implement and being persistent and work and collaborate and not work in silos. So that I think there's a bigger conversation here, but let's start dreaming and visualizing and scheming of a better South Africa and indeed a better Africa.
I like that, Roland. Aspiring, collaborating and innovating. Those three themes that I think are so central to any progression for us and the communities and those that we serve. So thank you for that. And thanks for your perspectives there on behalf of the young urbanists. Sebastian, you have the privilege of explaining a bit about where people can now find out more in terms of the website. Also, if you've listened to this point, you're probably asking yourself, well, what's in it for me? What is the prize? It's a contest. So let's deal with that as well. And then the all important, when would people need to respond by in order to make your cutoff?
First and foremost, we aim on acknowledging all entries. So as soon as you enter for the Now competition, we look very much forward to sharing your ideas, all of them, with the greater public, unless you stipulate otherwise. You can register at www.nownowcompetition.com. If you're a South African, you should know how to spell Now. You can also follow us at the Now Competition on Instagram. First prize will win 25,000 Rand to share between their team, cold hard cash. Second prize will be 10,000 Rand, and the third prize will be 5,000 Rand. And we will be posting about any sort of honorable mentions going forward. However, none of that has been confirmed. We are also hoping to somehow secure Formula E tickets for all our winners, but none of that has been confirmed. And the closing date for our submission will be on the 30th of October, 2023. So you have a few months to get involved. Once again, thanks to everyone for joining us in the jury. I think this conversation has got me extremely excited and can't wait to share it with the team.
Thanks to you, Sebastian, for having the vision and the insight and approaching us to try and talk to you and the team about it. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I think it's critical that if you've listened to this and want to respond, that you get hold of the actual contest outline. It talks about how to submit, what's physically required. There are do's and don'ts that are reflected there that'll help you. The bottom line is that this has been an inspiration. It's about, I say, challenging convention, challenging something that has come into our space here in Cape Town, which I think, grateful for that we have Formula E. But what more can it be? Where can we take this to, and how can we play with convention? And I think each of you in your own way and your own turns at addressing the challenges have looked at it through different perspectives and said, this can be something so much more than that. And we're asking the question of how, and you've actually not just sat back and navel gazed it. You've said, we're going to put something on the table. We're going to put a contest into play. We're going to test some of the convention, but B, the way that things get done. And really, really more strength to all of you, young group of professionals trying to look at things differently and actually putting in the effort. So thank you for what you're doing, and I wish you the very best. We'll no doubt pick up on this. Once you've had your respondents, you've had a chance to look at it, be a real privilege to come back and chat about what did come in and how did you go about selecting first, second, third prize, and the lessons learned in terms of whichever way it goes, where to from here. The very fact you've got your Now architecture competition, my assumption, my hope was that this is the first, not the once off, that you'll keep coming back to this. There's always, and as you say, the South Africanism, we need to do things now. Thank you to each of you, to Lloyd there in France, to Sarah in London, Sebastian in Amsterdam, and Roland here in Cape Town. Thanks so much for your time this afternoon, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your week. Keep safe. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thanks, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this content of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. That's @TalkingTransfo and the number 1, or alternatively via our email address talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Thanks and recognition also to Tribal Need for allowing us to use their track Flags as our introductory and closeout music on this podcast.